All right, so I'll just start this off with pushy people that are disconnected from what matters. And I was just thinking about this and how this has been one of like my anxieties with regard to, being more open and connecting with more people, is that, this feeling of being, suddenly coerced, by people who, have really strong, aggressive attitudes that are kind of unconscious or are definitely unconscious. And suddenly they get really, they expect you to get into line because this is just, it's either some feeling in them got triggered where it's really an emotional, thing for them, and you just can't reason with them, or they're so, it's such a staple or habit or a way of viewing things and a personal ethic that they've sort of assimilated from the world, that makes them feel like they have the authority to essentially tell you what to do without really being connected to what's really important, which is whenever you want to convince anyone to do anything, you first need to really, you need to have a certain level of trust, and you need to have a foundation of, good communication with them. And you don't just suddenly throw a hissy fit and then expect them to change the way they do things on the fly. And you don't do this with adults, and you don't do it with children. And this was often done to me as a child, where I had some guardian or parent that would suddenly kind of pull the rug out from underneath my feet of me sort of feeling kind of ambushed by suddenly all of a sudden there's this frenzy, and I'm expected to completely alter my way of doing things, and completely throw away my own considerations of what I think is reasonable. And now I'm having to follow some edict from somebody who's not really connected, and who's more functioning from a state of hysteria rather than actually being connected to their own feelings and the feelings of people around them. And I think that's it's an unfortunate sort of deficit within. So there's this disconnect of not really these parents and guardians and authorities who are not really, they don't even understand the fundamentals of how to persuasiveness, and how to be part of a team that is effective, and how to be kind in a way that is actually not, it's not just for the purpose of kindness, but it's also just the pragmatic reality that if you want people to be part of they want you to include them in their future, then you have to kind of treat them with respect. And if you do want them to do something differently, you need to have a reasonable explanation for them, where they can make peace with what it is that they wanted to do, and then let go of that, and then change their way of doing things for you, because now they're whenever we change a way we do something for somebody else, that's it's a concession that should be honored with gratitude, that hey, I appreciate it. It's not just that you're doing this because this is the right way of doing it, but no, you're honoring my, my preferences, because that's what it comes down to. Is when we change for others, what we're doing is we're honoring their preferences, and regardless of whether or not their way of doing it correctly, was the correct way of doing things, we still are the ones who made the adjustment for them. So that sort of needs to be always, respected. And, it's sort of funny, when I was younger, you'd often hear like how younger people don't have respect for their elders. Well, who's the one who was teaching this disrespect? It's like, if you want respect, you got to teach respect, and you got to be respectful, and you got to be respectful of not just, the old, but also the young. You got to treat everyone with respect, and you got to, respect. Respect doesn't necessarily mean deference. Respect means, it's like, I respect that, if I want to jump over a gap and the gap is too far, that I will fall into the gap. Respect is about understanding the reality of the situation. It's more about pragmatics. So that's, one of the things that I wanted to cover. Yeah, so often, felt disrespected as a child and, as a young adult. And, I think real respect, understanding that to, have a good relationship with, those who are, are our subordinates, they're not our subordinates because, we're better than them. They're our subordinates because they're filling a role and we're filling a role. We're filling the role of leadership, and they're filling the role of, whatever tasks there are to do. And the leader is not the leader because he's better or because she's better. The leader is the leader because they're an effective leader, because they know how leadership, because they have leadership skills. And unfortunately, in the world that we live in, we think, a lot of leaders that are put into positions of power are not really leaders, because they're not really, they're not competent. So they're not, they think that they reach this promotion and then they have this position, but they're not really, and then they think that means that they're above people and that people should listen to them because they're a leader. No. Nobody listens to you because they're supposed to. No, people only listen to you because you inspire them, you encourage them, you have good communication skills, you know how to reach their heart, you understand what matters to them. Every good leader knows what each member of his team cares about and why they're there. Because if they don't, you're going to have a mutiny in some way, or you're going to have delinquency in some way, because when the people underneath of you don't respect you because you're not treating them with respect, then they lose respect, and then they want to get revenge because and then they'll start doing little passive aggressive behaviors or destructive behaviors, essentially, in the background, and you may not even fully understand why or be aware of it, because you just think like, I'm the leader, why are they being unruly? Well, it's because you're a shitty leader. That's essentially it. So it's like, this lack of respect is essentially one of the things that has, been something that I was, treated with profound lack of respect. And so, like that kind of got internalized in terms of just fearing other people and like feeling that like when I'm around other people, I kind of have to like pretend that they're more, qualified than they really are when it comes to decision making. Because a lot of people just, they just think their opinions are supposed to be good enough for you, or their, whatever their emotional habits are is supposed to be good enough, or whatever they feel strongly about is supposed to be good enough to be persuasive. But, to me, you're going to have to come up with something better than that. You're going to have to like convince me on an intellectual and emotional level, to get me on your side. And that's not me being difficult. That's just me being a healthy, normal human being, But, the unhealthy part of me, is sort of used to masking, around people and, capitulating in ways, and then, allowing my boundaries to be crossed because I feel sort of obliged to, because I know that they have this assumption that, that they think that they know what they're doing, and because when I was younger, I felt like, the assumption was that I didn't know what I was doing, and then I just sort of like, the appropriate thing is to just let people kind of, do what they're gonna do, and then try my best to, work around it. That kind of dissuaded me from wanting to have more, relationships. Quite, that's like one of the major reasons. Just because, this feeling, and I know that like partially this is my sort of responsibility and my wound. The feeling of like having this tendency to kind of like capitulate on the surface, and then just like avoid those people. Like when I start to feel like they don't really know how to communicate well and aren't really respectful, and they don't really speak from what really matters to them, and they're just kind of avoid, the emotional part of themselves, and they're not really being sincere or upfront. Then they like want to have strong opinions about stuff that doesn't really like. It's like, yeah, but like, how does that really affect you and me? It's like, I don't really care what you think about this and that, because that's just like you emotionally bypassing, to like have, so it's like a way of like allowing yourself to have strong feelings about things that aren't like personal to you, and I think that's like where a lot of people, they use religion and politics to vent their strong feelings, because they're not allowed to have strong feelings in their personal lives about their personal things. And so they want to talk about like, how big of a deal everything else, something somewhere outside of, their personal lives is like really like a big, thing to be emotional about. But anyhow, yeah, so that's, just, something that I wanted to sort of record and talk about, think about. Yeah, like one of my fears about connecting with people is just this, this having to like have this false, this feeling of like having to, be really like pretend to be more agreeable with people, where I really feel to challenge, like where my real instinct is to challenge them and say, hey, you don't really know what you're talking about. You don't really know what you're doing. Like, can you please like show me something real? Can you really like, can you show me who you really are? Can you like, please stop giving me a mask, because it's like making me feel like I'm supposed to mask as well, and I really hate doing that. Like I don't, that's not something that I do as a recreation. Socializing to me is not like mutually agreed upon masking, and it's, that shit is fucking boring to me. I just want to be, we don't have to be always talking about everything, heavy and stuff. It's just, if we are going to have strong emotions and stuff, well, let's talk about what's really bothering us. Let's not like outsource our emotions to like, things that are so far out of our reach of having any real ability to control that we're not really being real anymore. Anyhow, so I'll leave it here. Have a good one.